Fire lookout Renata Voss radios down from her tower above the Chilcotin Plateau, voice shaking. Not about smoke, but its absence. Below her, a mountainside that was green 3 weeks ago has turned rust-colored, as if paint had been poured across 40,000 hectares overnight. No lightning, no chainsaw, no scorched earth. Yet by every visual measure, the forest is dying in real time, and she can't explain why. When British Columbia's Forestry Service sends a helicopter to confirm what Renata is seeing, they already suspect the cause. They've seen it before, just never at this scale. What she has stumbled onto in the early 2000s isn't an isolated patch of dead pine. It's the leading edge of what will become the largest forest die-off ever documented in North America. A transformation eventually visible from space, spreading across more than 25 million hectares from interior British Columbia down to Colorado's Front Range. The culprit is smaller than a grain of rice. Not fire, not virus, but a native insect that has lived quietly in these mountains since long before Europeans arrived. Dendroctonus ponderosae, the mountain pine beetle. The real puzzle facing scientists after Renata's call isn't just how something so tiny could cause continental-scale devastation. It's why, after thousands of years of coexistence, the beetle suddenly abandoned its natural role and became an unstoppable force. This is a story that belongs to the interior of British Columbia as much as it belongs to entomology. The forests of the Caribou and Chilcotin regions have always been bound up with the identity of the people who live among them. Secwepemcthig and Chilcotin communities whose knowledge of fire cycles and pine regeneration stretches back centuries, and the logging towns that grew up around sawmills in the 20th century, their economies stitched directly into the health of the surrounding pine stands. In towns like Quesnel and Williams Lake, the forest isn't scenery, it's payroll. It's the reason a town exists at all. So when the mountains start turning red, it isn't just an ecological event, it's an existential one. Within 2 years of Renata's discovery, provincial researchers estimate the outbreak has already killed enough merchantable pine to fill hundreds of thousands of logging trucks. By the time the epidemic reaches its peak roughly a decade later, British Columbia alone will have lost more than 18 million hectares of forest to this single species, making it the largest recorded mountain pine beetle epidemic on the planet. Provincial officials will eventually tally the economic toll in the billions of dollars: lost timber revenue, collapsed sawmill towns, decades of reduced harvest projections, and hundreds of millions spent on salvage logging and forest management in a desperate attempt to keep pace with a crisis that keeps outrunning every response. To understand how something this small could cause something this large, the investigation has to go where the human eye can't, beneath the bark, into the narrow, secretive world where the mountain pine beetle actually lives and kills. A single beetle boring into a healthy, mature pine is not a threat. Trees have defended themselves against bark beetles for millions of years, using thick, sticky resin to flood and drown intruders before they can establish a foothold. For most of forest history, that defense worked. A lone beetle attacking a vigorous tree is essentially committing suicide, pitched out or entombed in resin within hours. But mountain pine beetles don't attack alone. Female beetles that successfully bore into a tree release a chemical signal, an aggregation pheromone, that travels on the wind and calls in reinforcements. What begins as a single insect drilling into bark becomes, within days, a coordinated assault of thousands of beetles converging on the exact same tree at the exact same time. It's a strategy built entirely around exhausting a defense system through sheer numbers. The tree can drown 10 beetles. It cannot drown 10,000. Once the resin defenses are overwhelmed, the outcome is no longer in question. And the beetles don't kill alone either. As they bore in, they carry with them microscopic blue stain fungi, primarily Grossmania clavigera and Ophiostoma montium, packed into specialized pouches on their bodies. Once inside the tree, the fungi spread rapidly through the sapwood, clogging the vascular tissue that carries water from root to crown. At the same time, beetle larvae tunnel through the phloem layer just beneath the bark, destroying the tissue responsible for transporting sugars produced by photosynthesis. The tree is being strangled from the inside and starved from the outside simultaneously. Within weeks, needles that were vivid green begin fading to yellow. Within a year, they turn a deep, unmistakable red. By the second or third year, the needles fall away entirely, leaving a bare gray trunk standing among thousands of others just like it. A gray phase forest, a landscape of standing dead wood that can persist for decades. They would flare up in a stressed or fire-damaged stand, burn through the weakest trees, and then collapse on their own, checked by cold winters that killed beetle larvae before they could mature, by wildfires that created a patchwork of forest ages that beetles couldn't easily move through, and by predators and parasitoids that kept populations in balance. So the question that drives the second half of this investigation isn't really about the beetle at all. It's about what changed. If this relationship between insect, fungus, and tree has existed since the last ice age without ever producing anything close to this scale of destruction, then the beetle itself can't be the true explanation. Something in the forest, or around it, had to change first. Dr. Alan Carroll, a forest entomologist at the University of British Columbia, who has spent decades tracking beetle population dynamics, is one of the researchers who helps piece together what actually happened. His work traces a slow accumulation of changes across the 20th century, each one seemingly minor on its own, each one compounding into something enormous when combined. The first thread is winter cold, or the lack of it. Mountain pine beetle larvae are remarkably good at surviving freezing temperatures, producing a kind of natural antifreeze in their bodies. But that protection has limits. A hard cold snap of -35 degrees Celsius or lower, arriving before the insects have fully acclimated in autumn or after they've begun to lose cold tolerance in spring, can wipe out the vast majority of a local beetle population in a single night. For most of the 20th century, the interior of British Columbia could reliably count on those kinds of winter extremes. But by the 1990s, climate records show winter minimum temperatures across much of the province's interior warming measurably, and the number of nights cold enough to kill overwintering larvae declining sharply. Winters that once functioned as a natural population check simply stopped doing their job. The second thread is drought. Trees under water stress produce less resin and defend themselves less effectively. Multi-year droughts across the interior West through the late 1990s and 2000s left millions of hectares of pine, standing weakened and vulnerable, precisely as beetle populations were already beginning to climb. The third thread reaches back even further, to a policy decision made with the best of intentions. For most of the 20th century, forest management across Canada and the western United States prioritized aggressive wildfire suppression, putting out fires quickly to protect timber, property, and lives. But historically, periodic fire had done something beetles couldn't undo. It created forests of mixed ages, burning through old, dense pine stands and clearing space for young growth. Fire suppression, followed decades later by extensive post-war reforestation, left both countries with something the landscape had never really had before at this scale: enormous, continuous, even aged stands of mature lodgepole pine, all reaching peak vulnerability to beetle attack at roughly the same time. It was, in effect, an unbroken buffet spanning millions of hectares. Layer a warming climate, a series of severe droughts, and a landscape engineered by a century of fire suppression into one continuous expanse of susceptible pine, and the outcome stops looking like a natural fluctuation and starts looking like an inevitability. The beetle hadn't evolved into something new. The forest around it had been quietly reshaped into the perfect conditions for catastrophe, one policy decision and one warm winter at a time. By 2006, the outbreak in British Columbia had already killed enough pine that satellite images of the province's interior showed a red and gray scar visible from orbit. Provincial economists were by then estimating losses in the range of tens of billions of dollars in reduced timber value alone, factoring in decades of diminished harvest, collapsed mill towns, and the enormous cost of salvage operations racing to recover merchantable wood before the dead trees became too brittle and checked to process. Compare that to what a cold snap would have cost the province to produce naturally. Nothing. A single hard frost at the right moment in October could have killed more beetle larvae for free than British Columbia's entire multi-billion-dollar salvage logging program managed to remove through years of chainsaws and helicopters. But the story doesn't end with loss, and this is where the documentary takes its sharpest turn, because the forest that appears to be dead is, quite literally, teeming with life. Return to one of those gray, standing dead, stands a few years after the beetles have moved through, and the first thing you notice isn't silence. It's percussion. A rhythmic, hollow knocking echoes through the trunks. A sound that, at first, seems almost mocking, as if something is celebrating in the ruins. It's a black-backed woodpecker, sooty and precise, hammering into bark in short, controlled bursts. Nearby, an American three-toed woodpecker works a neighboring trunk with the same purposeful rhythm. These birds are drawn to beetle-killed forests in extraordinary numbers, and their presence solves one part of the mystery while opening another. Beneath the bark of these standing dead pines, beetle larvae are still present by the millions, dormant but vulnerable. Woodpeckers specialize in flaking off bark and extracting larvae with astonishing efficiency. Researchers studying outbreak zones have documented woodpecker predation, removing a substantial share of overwintering larvae in heavily infested stands, all without a single dollar of government funding, a single helicopter flight, or a single liter of pesticide. It is, quite simply, one of nature's most cost-effective pest control programs, running entirely on its own. But watching more closely reveals something the woodpeckers are doing that matters even more than pest control. Every cavity a woodpecker excavates while foraging or nesting doesn't disappear once the bird moves on. It becomes real estate. Mountain bluebirds move into abandoned woodpecker holes. Black-capped chickadees raise broods in cavities carved the previous season. Northern flying squirrels glide between snags, using hollowed trunks as den sites. Little brown bats roost in loose, peeling bark and old cavities by the dozens. Small owls, northern saw-whet owls among them, take over larger excavations for daytime roosting. What looks, from a distance, like a graveyard of dead trees, is, on closer inspection, one of the densest concentrations of cavity-nesting wildlife found anywhere in the temperate forest. This is the part of the story that upends the audience's expectations entirely. The woodpeckers were never going to defeat the beetle. No predator ever fully halts an outbreak of this magnitude. That was never their role. Instead, they are the first architects of what comes next, transforming a forest of dead trunks into a vertical apartment complex for species that would never have found this many nesting sites in a dense, living, closed canopy pine stand. The destruction, it turns out, is also construction. Because the transformation doesn't stop with birds and bats. As dead trees begin to fall, some within 5 years, others standing for 2 decades or more, before finally toppling, sunlight that hasn't touched these forest floors in generations pours through gaps in the canopy for the first time. Within 3 to 5 years of an initial attack, understory plants that were suppressed under a dense, shaded pine canopy begin to explode outward. Shrubs like buffaloberry and saskatoon spread rapidly. Wildflowers bloom in densities the forest hasn't supported in decades. Pollinator activity increases measurably in these gap-filled stands, drawing native bees and butterflies into areas that were previously too shaded to support them. And beneath all of it, quietly, a new generation of lodgepole pine begins to germinate. Lodgepole pine is a species famously adapted to disturbance. Many of its cones are serotinous, sealed shut with resin that only releases seed under intense heat, an adaptation built for wildfire. But mountain pine beetle outbreaks, even without fire, create the light and nutrient conditions young pine seedlings need to establish. And over the following decade, researchers monitoring beetle-killed stands document new cohorts of pine, aspen, and other species rising up beneath the standing dead trunks of their predecessors. Deer and elk move into these regenerating openings to browse on the new shrub growth. The forest that appeared, from Renata Voss's fire tower, to be dying in real time, is, on a longer timeline, simply changing shape. This is ecological succession, and it is the true hidden force behind everything the audience has watched unfold. Not a rival predator, not a miracle cure, but the forest's own long-evolved capacity to reorganize itself after disturbance. The mountain pine beetle didn't break that cycle, it initiated it, the same way it has for thousands of years, just at a scale so vast this time that it became visible from orbit instead of confined to a single valley. Which brings the investigation to its final, uncomfortable turn. Because if this is simply how these forests have always renewed themselves, insect outbreak, decomposition, woodpecker colonization, light penetration, regeneration, then the beetle was never really the villain of this story at all. It has been performing the exact same ecological role in these mountains since long before written history, quietly recycling old and stressed pine, clearing space in the canopy, feeding an entire community of birds and mammals along the way. What changed wasn't the beetle's behavior. What changed was everything around it. Warmer winters that stopped killing overwintering larvae, drought that left trees defenseless, and a century of fire suppression and reforestation that built, without anyone intending to, an unbroken continent of vulnerable, same-aged pine, stretching from British Columbia into New Mexico. The beetle simply did what it has always done, at a scale that human land management inadvertently made possible. 25 million hectares later, provincial and federal governments across 2 countries have spent billions of dollars trying to manage a crisis that, at its root, was never really about the insect at all. It was about the conditions humans had spent a century quietly engineering into these mountains, one well-meaning decision at a time. Today, in the valleys around Quesnel and Williams Lake, the forest is neither the green stand Renata Voss remembers, nor the rust-red wall she reported from her tower. It's something in between, a patchwork of standing gray snags, fallen deadwood slowly returning to soil, and young pine and aspen rising through gaps that didn't exist 20 years ago. Woodpeckers still work the remaining snags. Bluebirds still nest in their abandoned holes. And somewhere beneath the surface of the bark on a handful of surviving mature pines nearby, the next generation of beetles is likely already stirring, waiting for warmth, waiting for the right conditions, ready to begin the cycle again whenever the balance tips once more. Whether that balance tips sooner or later now depends on factors far beyond any single forest, any single province, or any single winter, on how much warmer these mountains become, on how future generations manage fire and forest age structure, on choices that haven't been made yet. The mountain pine beetle didn't destroy these forests. It revealed exactly how much they had already changed, and it left behind a landscape quietly rebuilding itself in ways that are only beginning to be understood. Somewhere out there right now, another fire lookout is probably watching a slope of green pine, with no idea what's already moving beneath the bark.